foreign correspondent Richard Brady arrives in Africa to report on a nationalist insurgency that has gripped a once beautiful country. An innocent newcomer, he then struggles to stay neutral in a bitter war waged with terror and atrocity happening by both sides. So he is soon drawn to Patience, who is a young township teacher with a fast tongue and sharp wit. The affair is tested when Brady discovers that his lover is recruiting his students to join the guerrillas and also helping to smuggle them across the border. So this is only a snippet of what this gripping novel, Love in a Lost Land by Dr James MacManus, is all about. And this morning he joins us virtually to discuss his latest offering a little bit better. Dr James, good morning. Thank you for your time on the SABC at this hour.
Good morning to you, and thank you for having me on the show.
I know that it's bright and early on your side. You're about an hour behind us. Perhaps we could delve into this offering now and look at the story. It's a love story. It's a story about war that is clearly set in the liberation window in Rhodesia back in the 70s. Perhaps you could speak to how you came to write such a book.
Indeed, thank you. I was based in Africa throughout the 70s. And in particular in Rhodesia. It was a very exciting and indeed turbulent time. The Portuguese Empire had fallen. Angola, Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau had become liberated, independent, and thus the war centered on Rhodesia, which was now surrounded with the exception of its border with South Africa. And it was that war that I reported on for 6 years, from 74 to 1980. It was an incredible time, a very exciting time, a time that has stayed with me all those years. And I just felt I had to write a book about that and express myself in a novel, which gave me a chance to tell a real story, but a story with obviously some imagination to it. But it's very largely based on my experiences there. And those experiences are of a country at war, of a very passionate love affair, and an ending which is described in the book, I think, a reasonably happy ending.
James,
so that's why I did it.
Thank you for not giving away too much. I actually wanted to also look at the style in which it's written, because it is in first-person narrative. It feels rather autobiographical. Perhaps you could speak to that. Perhaps also looking at how you aim to tell a different story about Rhodesia at large. Talk to us about that dynamic coming through.
Well, as I said, it is a very autobiographical novel.
Yes.
But let's remember that an awful lot of novels are exactly that. If you read Charles Dickens, you'll be reading a lot of his early life in his novels. But coming on from that, I'm no Charles Dickens. So, as I've said, it's based very much on my personal experiences. The people in the book will be very recognized by those who were there at the time. There are a few of us left, I'm afraid to say. And the events that took place in Rhodesia at that time, I think, are recorded pretty accurately, particularly the war scenes and the civilian sort of scenes back in Salisbury, then the capital of the country, and in the African townships, where much of the action in this book is played out. So, as I've said, very much based on my experiences, and I think that's why I determined to do it as a first-person narrative.
Yes.
It gives much more immediacy, I think, for the reader, and it takes the reader straight into the story.
And so based on what happened, do people who know you actually recognize themselves in the characters in the book? Or what's been the feedback on that front?
People, particularly the Zimbabwean diaspora here in England, in the UK, these are young people, but their parents, or grandparents in some cases, were all involved in the war. And these youngsters have read the book and have, with a few exceptions, told me how grateful they are to be reminded of what their parents and their grandparents went through. And we shouldn't forget that the Rhodesian War inflicted huge casualties upon the civilian population, largely out in the countryside, in the bush. There were atrocities on both sides by Rhodesian troops and by African nationalist forces. And those atrocities were inflicted upon a civilian population largely. So it was a very tragic, indeed an appalling time, really, for people out in the bush. And it's their grandparents or their grandchildren who have come to me and said the book really, really has made them see the kind of life that their forebears had to live at that time.
James, let's unpack this a little bit further, because in the prologue, and I'm just paraphrasing, you really speak about the relationship between power and privilege, yielding to the tides of the time. And I wonder on the back of that, if you could also explore the moral jeopardy theme that comes through. The main character, Richard Brady, obviously has to toss between that dilemma for himself. Help us understand that a little bit further.
Thank you, Lisa. You're tossing two questions in one at me, which I'll try to deal with. Can I just remind your listeners, this is a book called Love in a Lost Land, and I'm James MacManus, the author. And I just wanted to make that point in case anybody felt enthused to buy it, because it is on Amazon. So and now I've got that particular commercial out the way. Power and privilege, yes. If you look back at what happened in Rhodesia, you will see the result of that war was inevitable. Power held by a very small white minority, the privilege being that of the larger African majority, 6 million at the time, who inevitably were going to win this war. So it was partly a numbers game, partly, the local population had been there for centuries and centuries, and the white settler community had been there for 90 years. So the result was pretty much inevitable, I think. Now, moral jeopardy. This is something that almost every foreign correspondent, indeed all of us, if you like, in our lives, faces at one time or another. I got there to Rhodesia in 1974 thinking this was very simple. A white, rebel, racist regime against a black liberation nationalist force. Well, it wasn't quite like that when I got there. That was a very simple way of looking at it. And it impressed me, or rather, it surprised me to find that the Rhodesian army had a large number of African forces in it, 3 battalions of the Rhodesian African Rifles. And I had to try and work out that against also the fact that a lot of the white settler community that I talked to, who've been there for generations, had indeed, as they pointed out to me, helped build the country up. In fact, they had. They created out of pretty much virgin bush in the 1890s an extraordinary country. But what they didn't know, or what they chose to forget, was they'd done this in partnership with the African population. And that partnership they had forgotten. And had they actually really embraced that partnership and made the African population recognize they'd done it together, we wouldn't have had the war. Now, the moral jeopardy in which I found myself was that recognizing that the white settler population had actually built this country up with African help, placed me in a difficult situation, because my editors in London, and indeed where The Guardian, my newspaper, syndicated to, expected a straightforward black-white situation. And yet that wasn't what I found on the ground. So there was a conflicting sort of set of moral values, if you like. And my hero, Richard Brady, has to deal with that. And he finds it quite difficult. Now, we all in our life deal with these moral situations, moral questions, and moral jeopardy. And this was, in my case, probably the most difficult.
Well, Dr. James, it's also interesting to see how the power of a novel can also change or play a role in challenging the status quo. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to have to leave it there. But I want to thank you very much for joining us on the SABC at this hour. And thank you for sharing your latest offering. Dr. James MacManus, he is an author, really just joining us this morning, chatting to us about his latest novel. It is called Love in a Lost Land. Do get yourself a copy.